They say they're my bank. They've confirmed my postcode and my account number. They say they've spotted suspicious activity on my account. They could be my bank. Now they've asked me to move my money to a safe account they've set up. That tells me they are not my bank. My money? My info? I don't think so.
A genuine bank will never contact you asking you to move your money to a safe account. Take 5 to stop fraud.
Well done, Linda. We are now going to turn to our final speaker of the evening, Peter Hitchens. Peter Hitchens is a journalist and author, currently a columnist for the Mail on Sunday. He's been a resident correspondent in Moscow and Washington and has visited 57 countries on assignment, from North Korea to the DRC. His latest book, A Revolution Betrayed, is about the destruction of state grammar schools and the resulting effects on the education system. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Do I call you Mr. President yet, or is it? No, okay. I get these things right. I'm trying to remember that point of information I was going to come up with. Well, it's so good. I speak this evening as a reformed imperialist. I was born an imperialist. I was born in the empire. I was actually born in the reign of His Majesty King George VI, King Emperor. My father had been, for many years before that, a serving officer in the Royal Navy enforcing British hard power from Shanghai to Buenos Aires. On one occasion, he'd been called back from halfway across the Atlantic to go and put down riots in Haifa, in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine. So I also grew up with something of a knowledge of the extent and nature of the British Empire and of what it did and of how the current world came into being. And this seems to me to lie beneath any discussion of this kind. The task of all intelligent people discussing any of these matters is surely to penetrate the disguises in which history advances itself. Things are simply not always what they seem or what they are portrayed to be. And I find, as a journalist who has to watch many of these events firsthand and who has seen so many of them, that it's very distressing to see the way in which the modern world is so easily gulled and bemused into believing fantasies about what is going on around us. I'll come, I hope, at some point to the issue of Ukraine, where one of these fantasies is very much in play. But here we have a very major problem. All of the crises in which we intervene have long, deep roots. Some of them are even longer than I'm prepared to go back into. But take, for instance, Afghanistan. Two members of my close family were actually involved in the fighting in Afghanistan, and I therefore feel I have a rather strong stake in it. But what we have to realize here is that the crisis in Afghanistan, which we supposedly went in to sort out, was largely the result of the efforts of Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, in creating the Mujahideen forces in Afghanistan to drive the Russians out. The very same Mujahideen forces which we then found ourselves confronting as our bitterest enemy. There's an excellent film, both very funny and very intelligent, called Charlie Wilson's War, in which this absurd process is actually described in some detail, and it is very educational for anybody who can really wishes to stand up and say that the West intervened in Afghanistan for moral reasons. Our policy in Afghanistan is catastrophic, has been for many years, because it is one of those places where, during the Cold War in particular, the superpowers competed for influence. Where my relatives were fighting in Helmand, there were American canals built in the year 1949 as one part of intervention. Until not very long ago in Kabul, now a place of veils and burqas and grim Taliban censure, women wore the same sort of clothes that they wore in the West and lived lives very similar to those in the West before these interventions got going. I have personal experience of a couple of interventions. One, I was present in Mogadishu in the night when the US Marines arrived and George Bush Sr.'s attempt to sort out that disastrous country, one of many. What I learned there was, again, this had at one time an extremely prosperous and settled country. It now has a huge diaspora of highly intelligent and educated people who can't live there anymore because of the disastrous interventions by East and West to try and take control of it, and has sunk from the level of say, a highly civilized city in Mogadishu to a very, very dangerous slum. I saw that. It was also in Baghdad in the months after the Blair Bush intervention. And again, what you saw in Baghdad was catastrophe, the higher catastrophe imposed on a country already in severe difficulties thanks to idiotic Western sanctions, resulting in greater and greater chaos. The ridiculous, yes indeed.
I'll try and speak up, hopefully you can hear me.
I can so far.
On that point of idiocy, and noting also Yasmin's point of policy framing not surviving contact with reality, do you not find that the term Western intervention discussed in this debate is so inherently unstable, so normalizing, and so contested that ultimately we will be unable to come to any meaningful conclusion whatsoever?
Well, no, on the contrary, actually. I think that if we discuss it properly, we will be able to come to the meaningful conclusion of voting the motion down. And the first Western intervention I can think of in the 20th century is the intervention by Imperial Germany in Russia, in which they financed with tons of gold and enormous amounts of other help the coup d'etat by Vladimir Lenin, which destroyed the only democracy Russia has ever had and reduced that country for 70 years to tyranny, poverty, misery, and secret police. That was the first Western intervention I can think of. Another one which comes to mind very much is the Western intervention conducted by this country in the United States in Iran in 1953, and the overthrow of the legitimate leader of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, an action which still has bitter and dangerous consequences for the whole world. Our intervention in Iraq, of course, follows the British takeover of Iraq as a post-World War I mandate in the 1920s, and their misgovernment of it, our misgovernment of it during that time. These things go back and back and back. That is what intervention is. And we occasionally hear, and we're bound to hear this evening, about Rwanda, that horrible massacre which everybody says we should have intervened to stop. Well, if we are so concerned in the Western world about such horrors, why didn't we intervene to stop it? Is it perhaps because the purpose of intervention by the West is not to stop massacres? The purpose of intervention in the West has some other reason, some other purpose, some other aim, which has nothing to do with humanitarian intervention. Take another example, which I think has to be examined here. I will try to, there are so many of these, I'll try to be brief. There was some time ago an event called the Arab Spring, in which it was believed by many people in the West that we were about to see a birth of democracy and freedom in the Arab countries. Well, here's the thing. When democracy and freedom arrived in Egypt, as I witnessed, the main beneficiary body was the Muslim Brotherhood, a group of people who were not approved of at all in the West. They did not desire to see Egypt ruled by the Muslim Brotherhood. So, good heavens, what happened? The Egyptian army intervened and removed the Muslim Brotherhood very undemocratically and brutally from office, and massacred people in the streets of Cairo on an absolutely astonishing scale, barely reported in this country, so as to frustrate the very democracy we had claimed to be in favor of. What is this rubbish? What is this rubbish? We simply do not have a clue what we are doing, if what we are doing is what we say we are doing. If you have a genuine and heartfelt and decent animus against the mistreatment of people in faraway countries of which you may know something or nothing, I don't care. If you have that, then you must consistently apply it. If you do not consistently apply that outrage, if you do not act to stand against it and prevent it where it happens, then it is not a reason for your action, it is a pretext. Yes, indeed.
You mentioned the Arab Spring, you mentioned that we should always do this, always intervene no matter what. But a lot of things happen, logistics, money, support. But I ask you this, would you have said that the U.S. and the Western countries should have done nothing when Gaddafi's murderous troops and tanks rolled on Benghazi ready to slaughter an independence movement?
I don't need to argue whether we should do nothing. You need to argue whether we should do something. We're not in a... I'm not in a position personally to do something, although as I have pointed out, and I stress it because it's important, close members of my family have been in harm's way on these episodes. So I do have a stake in this. I'm not in a position to say to them, go and risk your lives, go and risk having your limbs blown off and your intestines strewn over the ground for some idealist standing in a balcony in Cambridge. I haven't got that right. It doesn't exist. If you really seriously want to send people on these expeditions, I suggest strongly that you need a more consistent, well-worked out, historically informed, and frankly decent belief in what it is that you want to do. Now again, if we actually had managed to achieve the modern liberal democracy which we claim to want in Afghanistan, and it elected a Taliban government, which immediately voted to impose the burqa and all kinds of other Islamic strictures on that country, what would we do? Would we say, congratulations on your democracy, you get on with doing that? Or would we say, no, actually, you can't do that and intervene again? Is this consistent? Of course it's not. It has no consistency. That is why I say it's a pretext. Now, an awful lot, I have to finish with this because it's a point which I almost alone make in this country, and it's so vital that people at least hear it made in a country which has almost entirely ceased to debate anything adversarially in the past few months. In Ukraine, we are told that what we see is a brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine. And indeed, we do see a brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine. No question of that, one which is indescribably filthy and which nobody can defend. But did that invasion simply come out of nowhere? Well, no, it didn't. The whole point about that invasion was that it was the result of many, many years, going back at least to 2008, of systematic goading of Russia by the Western powers. The expansion of NATO, a policy, this is an amazing thing, a policy simultaneously decried by Henry Kissinger and Noam Chomsky. The only thing, as far as I know, which has ever united those two gentlemen in history is that they both think that NATO expansion into Eastern Europe was stupid. Even Robert Kagan, probably the most aggressive hawk on the Russian issue in Washington, has written in Foreign Affairs that the Russian invasion was provoked. Why was it provoked? Well, it's an interesting question, and we haven't got time to discuss it. It's another debate. But the point is, the roots of what happened in February this year lie much further back in other things. And where we convince ourselves that what we are doing is making humanitarian invasions, we are often buying stories sold to us by politicians who have other things in mind. And that, as I say, is why we tend not to intervene in so many places where, if our policy truly were humanitarian intervention, we would intervene, and why we also intervene in several places where it obviously isn't humanitarian. I offer you this because it seems to me to be vital that we understand that in many cases what we are being asked to do is to approve of ourselves. We're not actually being asked to do good, we're being asked to feel good about ourselves, because we can say, oh look, we intervened. Look, it isn't as easy to get an army or a state into a country as it is to get a television crew into one. In fact, it's 3 million times more difficult. And when you get there, you have to stay. And for how long are you prepared to stay? And whose brothers, sisters, sons, and husbands and fathers are you prepared to send there? For how long? To die in how many numbers so that it can be done? If you genuinely believe all that stuff, then that's fine by me. If you're gulled by propaganda, then I'm sorry for you, and I really do think that if you come to an institution like Cambridge University, you ought to know better. But whatever the truth is, an enormous amount of supposed humanitarian, benevolent intervention in the world today is dressed up as that, when it is in fact something else. And that is why I very much urge you, I have finished, I very much urge you to oppose the motion. Thank you so much.